Ka tangi te titi, ka tangi te kaka, ka tangi hoki a hau, ti hei Māori ora. Let the seabird cry, let the mountain parrot cry, even I cry out, behold the breath of life. And a mana, and a reo, aura rakatira mā, tēnā koutou, tēnā rā kātou katoa. Ko Waiau, ko Richard Blakey Takawingawa, no o te poti a hau, ko Kotarani te iwi, he kai mahi a hata wharewālanga o tākau, tēnā koutou katoa. Good evening, everyone. My name is Richard Blakey. I'm the Deputy Vice-Chancellor for Research and Enterprise here at the University of Otago from Dunedin. And it's my great pleasure on behalf of the Vice-Chancellor, who can't be here tonight. He is in Canada. Often he will try and look in on IPLs if he's away, but I imagine the time zones in Canada means that he may not be joining us tonight. But it is my pleasure to act on his behalf, to welcome you here tonight to the inaugural professorial lecture of Professor Brent Lovelock. Come on in, welcome, and thrice welcome. IPLs are wonderful occasions for the inaugural professor, although they are probably sometimes rather nervous occasions for the person. They are wonderful occasions for our academic community. I know as academic leaders in the university, we look forward to these as times where we can unplug from the administration and other matters of the day and just reflect on the outstanding achievements in teaching, research and service that our fine academic staff undertake in discharging their duties as members of our academic staff. And being awarded the status of professor at the University of Otago is no mean feat, particularly to be promoted from within. We set very high standards and we go through a very rigorous promotion process whereby we demand and require outstanding performance across all of the components that make up an academic role of teaching, of research and of service. And we benchmark that against the highest international standards by using referees. We also look for strength and leadership in these promotions to differentiate that professorial role from other roles in the university. So congratulations, Brent, on that. Albeit that your promotion was some time ago and this celebration of it has been delayed by RSLs and other things. So as well as a celebration for our academic community, it's also one where we welcome members of the public, and for those members of the public here or online, welcome and thrice welcome. And in particular, we're often members of families of the professor and other significant people in their lives are present. And I have some shout outs for a number of people: Rebecca, Jason, Amelia, Oliver and Tom, Hobbs and Neve. Anna Carr is here. Kia ora, Anna. So to your whānau, welcome. To Jessica Thompson and Matariki Inwood, welcome to you too. And I understand, Brent, that your children may and probably are online right now from the US or the UK. That's Levi, Millie and Oscar. So to you, welcome, and others who are beaming in from afar, welcome. My role is very simple. I just have to say how proud we are as a university to be celebrating the achievements of a new professor. I have really enjoyed in my time here with Brent and with other colleagues in the Department of Tourism interacting with you, and know that you bring forward those qualities of an academic that we really value in connecting your research and your teaching to people. Your students look up to you as an outstanding supervisor. You're highly sought after for supervision. Your research connects to communities, and I got direct experience of that in 2018, sitting on a panel with you in Invercargill for the Winter Symposium series, where I learned what a difference you have made to communities within Aotearoa, from Waiheke to the Catlins and beyond, in your role as a practically minded academic who looks to apply their knowledge to the needs and interests of communities. I will always remember the person from the Catlins talking about the work that you had done to develop and help them develop their regional tourism strategies, so that your work leaves an indelible and enduring mark on the communities of Aotearoa. So From me and from the university, congratulations on your promotion. It's now my pleasure to hand over to Professor Robin Gould, the Pro-Vice-Chancellor in the Division of Commerce, to give you a more fulsome introduction. So, nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Ka tangi te tia, ka tangi te kaka, ka tangi hoki aho. Ko taranaki te maunga, ko mokau te awa, ko te mandra te waka. He ori o te whānau Finn, Goldsmith, Adlam, Gold, Hoki. Ko McGillivray tōku iwi no Otipoti aho. Ko Robin Gould tōku ingawa, ko te manataki o te Kurapakehi, o te wharewananga o Otago. Nō reira tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Well, very, very warm welcome to everyone here this evening, and a very, very special welcome and acknowledgement to Brent's whānau. Thank you very much for joining us here this evening. This is a very, very special occasion, as Professor Blakey has outlined already, so I won't say too much further about that. But what I do want to say is that Professor Brent Lovelock is a social scientist with a passion for advancing sustainable tourism through his research, teaching and service. He joined Otago and the Tourism Department in 1999 as an assistant lecturer, being awarded his PhD then from Otago in 2001. And he has since built an impressive, as Prof Blakey has already said, and diverse career, working on everything from coffee tourism in Rwanda through to sustainable tourism in the Catlins. He has risen steadily through the ranks to be promoted to full professor in 2019 and then head of department in 2020, a role in which he currently continues to serve. So Brent's research considers how we might manage tourism more effectively, and he's had over 80 peer-reviewed publications in the field, including a co-authored book, The Ethics of Tourism. Now, this book challenges us to consider more ethical approaches to managing the industry, which is of increasing relevance today, of course. And now I'm a great fan of books, not only because you can hold them, but also as books represent a depth of investigation and analysis that often catches multiple dimensions of one's work and thinking. So I've gone and looked at some of the reviews of the book, and reviewers have written of the book that the ethics of tourism is an important addition towards tourism sustainability theory. It has an inner structure that's easy to follow, combined with a novelty approach and practical application. It's enjoyable to read and could be appreciated by both academics and a more general audience. Another reviewer said that the ethics of tourism is a significant contribution to the tourism literature. It provides the first comprehensive review of ethics across the breadth of travel and tourism experiences. Now, Brent values engaging his students on this topic as they will play and already do a crucial role as our next generation of sustainable tourism managers. Brent's published work has been impressive in impact. Scopus, and those of us who are academics will know all about Scopus, lists almost 1,000 citations as of today and an H-index of 19. Google Scholar lists 2,182 citations as of today with an H-index of 27 and an I-10 index of 51, which is very impressive. Brent has held visiting appointments in Japan and India and works with a range of collaborators globally from Iran through to Norway. He's supervised 20 PhD students to completion in a range of areas of sustainable tourism, and is part of a university-wide team that has undertaken a 7-year program of research on education for sustainability. Brent and his collaborators have received multiple research grants and undertaken numerous research consultancies for government, industry and community partners. In 2020, he was awarded as Principal Investigator a prestigious and highly competitive Marsden grant under the title of Bad Nature, the Social Dimensions of Invasive Alien Species and Their Management in New Zealand, which corresponds very closely to the title for tonight's lecture. So without further ado, Deputy Vice-Chancellor and those here this evening, I am delighted to now invite Professor Brent Lovelock to deliver his inaugural Professorial lecture.
Can you hear me? You can. Wonderful. Thank you everyone for turning up tonight. Some of you might be in the wrong room, of course. You might be looking for Val McDermott, who's the Scottish crime writer, but too late because the doors are locked and so you're not going anywhere, I'm afraid. No, but sincerely, it's great to see everyone here. It was really, really very nice. So it's also a little strange because it's been a long time since I've actually given a lecture to anyone more than perhaps 2 people face to face because of COVID. So, and it's also a little strange, as Richard said, I first learned about my professorial promotion in 2018, late 2018. In those days, the Vice-Chancellor would ring each professorial applicant up and give them the good or bad news. And I remember getting a phone call. This was about 6 months after I applied for a professorship. I got a phone call from Harleen Hayne, who was the VC at the time. And she told me the good news, and she said, "It's fantastic, Brent. It was a unanimous decision. You've been made prof." And I said, "Thanks very much, Harleen. That's wonderful." Put the phone down, and I basked in my glory for a few seconds, and the phone rang again. And the voice said, "It's Harleen Hayne here again, Brent." And I said to her, "You made a mistake, didn't you?" She said, "Yes, I was looking at the wrong list." So it just goes to show that Vice-Chancellors can have a sense of humour, so thank you very much, Harleen, for that. So tonight I'm just going to try to explain why a tourism professor has such a wacky title up there about invasive species. I suppose tourists can be conceived as aliens. So there was a connection there. So I just want to chart my pathway of getting into this type of research and then to skip across some of what I think are quite cool or exciting little bits of research I've done. Then we'll finish off talking about the Marsden project, which we've got funded for recently. So without any further ado, let me introduce myself. Ko rohini te maunga, ko Manawatu te awa, ko Bolton te waka, ko Ngāti Pākehā te iwi, ko Brent Lovelock tōku ingoa, kia ora, tēnā koutou. So, that's my home, my homeland, the green lands of the Manawatu, that ecological disaster zone, where I was raised on a dairy farm there, constantly leaning into the sort of westerly winds that howled across as if there was a giant Dyson vacuum cleaner stuck in the Manawatu gorge, sort of sucking everything towards it. Beautiful. I was a flatlander. Those are my forebears, and they did a very, very effective job of removing almost every vestige of native vegetation in the Manawatu plains. And so basically the only remaining indication that there would have been 30-metre high, podocarp forest there, was this tiny little wee bit of native asplenium which grew right under a bridge that went across one of the streams in our farm, and it was so tucked in there that the cows couldn't get to it and nibble it off. And I was always sort of quite fascinated that it was this weird alien little creature that to me was alien, even though it was a native species, and that was hiding there for many, many years. And in fact, the only indication that land was once the land of the Rangatani people was actually a Māori adze that my great-great-grandfather had ploughed up and sat on his mantelpiece in his house. So a flatlander. And these are the obligatory embarrassing photographs of yourself when you're a child. There's my mum and dad and my middle brother Greg down at Himalayan Beach, where again we were invaded by alien blue bottles and would regularly get stung down there. Great beach, love that. And there's me with one of my calves, because it was my duty, of course, to work on the farm as when I was little, and I helped to feed the calves, and they had a champion calf every year, basically. And I used to chop thistles for 35 cents an hour. And I remember my dad's face when I asked him for a pay rise to 50 cents an hour. That was another way of contacting those invasive species way back in the day. And of course, I became a super child and then a super researcher, apparently. And then I became interested in hunting, shooting, killing things. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say that out loud, but we used to go eeling down in the creeks on our farm and in the neighbours' farms. And I know what you're thinking, who's that creepy kid with the guns? That's me. And that was when I worked for the Forest Service in a little hut stuck up in the forest in the middle of nowhere. Well, that was another sort of, I guess, second contact with invasive species, through shooting rabbits and possums. My mate had a little Volkswagen Beetle, and we used to take the front bonnet off, and I used to sit in the front there, wedged in behind the little petrol tank, and we'd cruise around the back roads with a Manawatu shooting possums and rabbits and anything we could actually see. And so then I envisaged a future where I would actually engage with nature as my career. So I envisaged a future where I would actually be travelling around all the national parks of New Zealand by helicopter preferably, and then dropping into these wonderful places and doing whatever I would do. So I applied for a Forest Service cadetship and was lucky to get one, and then spent a year, of course, in amongst pine trees, as you do. And this is a photograph of me and my fellow forestry trainees back in 79, and that's me with the funny little blue hat in the middle there. And ironically, we have these bags on our backs. They're planting bags, and we were planting larch actually then. This was introduced European larch. We were planting larch up in the highlands of the Wakarara Ranges in the Hawke's Bay. So over the top of native tussocks and any other native vegetation that might have been there. And we thought that was a wonderful thing to do in those days. Of course, we learn our lessons, don't we? So after forestry school, I went to Canterbury and did a honours degree in forestry science there. And that's him there, the sultry looking one, but there you go. And so after forestry school, of course I was bonded to the New Zealand Forest Service, and then we had to apply for a job somewhere in the country, and I thought, it'd be nice to go to Northland. So I applied for Northland and got sent to Southland, Invercargill to be precise, and ended up doing the job that I had actually dreamed about, which was flying around in helicopters from national park to national park, and undertaking a monitoring program for the impacts of invasive species, that is mainly deer and possums and hares and what have you. So it was a dream job, and we would use a combination of different methods. We would use vegetation plots where we'd have to count and measure the diameters of everything that was growing there, and we'd do bird surveys. And we also had this other method, and it was called fecal palate monitoring. So I became a scatologist, which is an expert in the poos of a range of different species. So if I can look at a possum poo, like that's possum poo there, and I can tell you how old it is. I can tell you what the possum had for breakfast and what was on his mind that day. And ironically, we made, some of the times up there in the forest, we made friends with the animals that we were supposed to be monitoring with the view to leading to eradication. And this was a little possum called Benji that we used to feed from one of the huts that we based ourselves in for a few months. Actually, we got in big trouble over that because the Director General of the Forest Service came to visit us, and the possum came to the window going, go away. And ironically, another part of the job was also looking at invasive species, which weren't considered to be invasive species then. This was a photograph taken up behind Queenstown in a place called Mount Aurum, which was a recreation or scenic reserve, I can't recall. And so these are plantings of exotic European pines that were planted there to actually stabilize that countryside because it's very, very slip, erosion prone. And so our job was to go in there and report on these species to see if they were surviving adequately. And of course, again, it's wonderful how things can change over the years. Of course, now those species have been sprayed and disappeared. But I remember writing a report that recommended that these species actually, we increase our planting of these species. Boo hiss. You're allowed to do the boo hiss thing, it's okay. But all good things must come to an end, and so my days as the Environmental Forester of Southland Conservancy for the New Zealand Forest Service ended in 1987 with the end of the Forest Service and when Department of Conservation was created. And so I returned up to the Manawatu, up to my homeland, and worked for DOC up there for a number of years in some different roles. One of them was engaging with landowners through the Protected Natural Area program, trying to protect little areas of pockets, the few little pockets of native vegetation that remained in the Manawatu. There's a photograph of me in my DOC uniform just to prove that that's what the DOC uniform was pretty cool in those days, actually. They weren't DOC-issued motorcycles, sadly, but anyway. So I worked with wonderful people up there like Ross Castles and Don Ravine, and worked with some pretty amazingly difficult invasive species as well, including Spartina grass and old man's beard or Clematis vitalba. But a lot of the time that I was working there for DOC on conservation planning and recreation planning, there was this sort of conflict going on because DOC were going through some very difficult times then. In fact, they couldn't even afford to run some vehicles. They'd put the vehicles up on blocks because they couldn't afford the staff or the fuel to actually run them. And from my perspective, there was some of the budget or funding from DOC was actually used in areas that were perhaps less important, and one of those areas was around managing tourism and recreation. At the time, there was no real strategy for how to do this sustainably in New Zealand. We had this, as in New Zealand, we had a goal of getting 3 million visitors into the country by the year 2000 or something ridiculous like that. But it had as much sort of rationale behind it as a fish burger. It was just a silly thing to do. So I wanted to then sort of investigate or envisage how we could have a sustainable nature-based tourism and recreation policy in New Zealand. And so I left DOC and approached a guy who's a bit of a hero of mine, Michael Hall, who's based up in Canterbury at the moment, but he was at the time at Canberra University, and I very shyly asked him if I could be his PhD student. And he said, go on then. And so I embarked on my PhD, which looked at sustainable tourism management. And I did my field work in Canada in places like this at Banff, which are renowned for the level of visitor pressure. Banff National Park gets about 5 million visitors a year. A huge amount of pressure on the communities that live there and on the ecosystems. But Canada also was my choice of field site because they have amazing mechanisms for coming to negotiated outcomes in these difficult types of problems. There's a photograph of me doing research with a Canadian participant just to prove that I was actually in Canada at the time. And the outcome of that in my PhD, or one of the papers, I think this was the second paper that I published, was Why It's Good to Be Bad, the role of conflict. And as the title suggests, conflict was actually a key ingredient for actually coming to sustainable outcomes for national parks at that time. So this interest-based negotiation, or the touchy-feely lovey-dovey approaches weren't actually working. So conflict was the winner at the end of the day. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through all of my publications one by one. Go on. How much time do we have? Okay. So I did one of these little wordy things where I threw all the titles of my papers and chapters and what have you into this sort of mixing machine, like a big sort of tumble mixer, and produced this little diagram which shows what your key sort of foci are from your research. That's a photograph of me when I was young and fresh-faced in my first year as a lecturer. Oh my God, I've been beaten down. But you can see that there's different areas of focus there. In fact, I remember James, when he was HOD back in the year dot in our Department of Tourism, Professor James Hyam, coming to me to have a chat about my research focus, and he strongly suggested that I just choose one subject and just focus on that for my entire academic career. Great advice, James. I ignored James and went on to actually, just as this picture here represents, look at a number of different topics. And so if we had to sort of come up with a menu for what my research foci, that's a silly word, isn't it, have been over the last 20 years, this would be the menu. So as an appetizer, we have consumptive wildlife tourism. Okay, that's not about tourists with a nasty cough. It's about wildlife tourism that consumes wildlife in a physical way, like hunting, shooting, and fishing, basically. So consumptive wildlife tourism, a little bit of sustainable tourism planning in the main course there, nature-based recreation, another option of ethical tourism, and then for dessert, invasive species. Okay, so that's what I'll whiz through some of those now. I've always had an interest, as I said before, on hunting and shooting and fishing, and that's me as a kid with shooting a hare. Just avert your eyes if you don't like that type of thing. And so I did a number of pieces of research looking at the economics of hunting, looking at the ethics of hunting, and eventually came up with this edited collection on tourism and the consumption of wildlife, which I think was a sort of a first at the time, because people hadn't really, I don't know, tourism researchers tend to engage more with the sort of lovey-dovey, touchy-feely side of tourism in terms of eco-tourism, and didn't really want to get involved with the sort of blood and guts side of that wildlife tourism. So pretty proud of that output, actually. And I still do dabble in that area of research. In fact, the Marsden research that we're doing now, but also some research that I completed recently in Japan on sabbatical a couple of years ago, involved hunting and shooting and fishing. And the project in Japan is quite interesting, because over there they have this explosion of wild pigs and deer. And there are some huge ramifications for that in terms of the huge damage to forests, to agriculture, and also actually impacting upon society as well in terms of actual attacks on individuals. So wild pigs, their range are increasing, and so they're encroaching on urban areas, and they have no fear of humans because they're hardly ever hunted now. So the population of hunters has declined to almost no hunters in Japan because of the aging population, because of urban growth and rural depopulation, and a number of other factors. It's really, really difficult to get a firearms license in Japan, for example, really, really expensive, and it takes a long, long time to get it. So all of these factors have impacted upon hunting. So at the moment, the Japanese government has embarked on this program of trying to actually encourage the Japanese people to eat the problem, okay? Because the Japanese people have lost the appetite for eating game meat, or gibier as it's called over in Japan. So there's a program trying to encourage people to eat wild boar, or inoshishi, and also the venison from the sika deer. So both of those are native species to Japan. But there's a problem, and what they're trying to do is actually to force it on the children, start with the children. And so the school lunches, they're actually sneaking in some of this wild game meat there into the school lunches, and the kids thought, they don't really like that very much. And so it's probably a counterproductive move in the long run, I think. But there are other obstacles as well. They're trying to encourage Japanese housewives to buy this venison from the deer, but of course, deer in Japan, they are a sacred animal, and you know, in Buddhism, they're revered. Deer as a creature there, so they have this sort of like a deity in Japan. And also in Japan, you go to quite a number of places where there are these deer parks. And these are some photographs from, Nara Deer Park. Nara is the ancient capital, so this is the imperial deer herd. And so you've got Japanese people like engaging very close. I was there and I got bitten on the bum by one of these deer because I thought I had some food in my pocket. So there's a huge obstacles in trying to eat the problem to try to address this invasive species problem. So this was a part of what I call my R3 research. So R3 is recruitment and retention and reactivation of people engaged in hunting and fishing, or basically any recreational activity. It could be golf or anything like that. And so these are three models, and they're mainly European or American sort of centric models. And they don't really take into account these sort of, I guess, these cultures that have a long history of engagement with these species in quite a different manner than what we have in sort of settler societies. And so looking at those religious aspects was a way of actually reshaping that and reconceptualizing those models of recruitment, reactivation, and retention. So, of course, in New Zealand, we don't have a problem with eating the problem. We like eating the problem. And there's some hunters taking home the problem to eat. We eat a lot of game meat. In fact, I'm involved in some really cool research with colleagues at Lincoln University, led by Dr. Gebior Degaragi, and we've just completed a survey of 1,000 New Zealand hunters, and we're looking at how they're using game meat for food security. And of course, food security is a huge issue in New Zealand today, and especially with declining incomes, well, the declining spending power of our incomes. And so we can't really share the results yet, but just some really early indicative results. I mean, probably 90% actually, I think, just from memory, of hunters find game meat a very good substitute for store-bought meat. And over 80% of hunters actually rely upon this meat for feeding their families. So invasive species, you could say predator-free New Zealand, get rid of all invasive species, but we have a large sector of our society that are reliant upon these animals for food. Somehow we've got onto this. Okay, so this is the next little branch of my research, which looks at tourism ethics. And so I was interested in how we can do tourism better and how tourism can be better for people, how we can do tourism ethically, basically. And so I engaged on a couple of projects working with travel agents and looking at what type of advice they would give to people who want to travel to really dangerous places where they could get seriously harmed, or what sort of advice I'd give to people who they think might be traveling for nefarious purposes, like, I don't know, perhaps a middle-aged guy might come in and want to travel to a destination which is renowned for sex tourism, but with children. So what do you do in those situations? And so that was interesting research because it showed how these travel agents as I guess, ethical agents sort of removed themselves from the ethical decision-making and distanced themselves. So I applied this, what's called the moral intensity sort of framework. So, I mean, they had no responsibility for something which would happen 10,000 kilometres away or 20,000 kilometres away, which was quite interesting. So then I took this research further and I thought, well, okay, there are some places that perhaps shouldn't be visited. And so I tried to depict what the world would look like if we decided all of a sudden we made this rule, this law, you're not allowed to travel to anywhere which has a human rights violation. And so I used a combination of Human Rights Watch ratings for every country in the world and international visitor arrival data, and I came up with these two scenarios. Okay, so the red countries are where you're not allowed to visit. Okay, so we can see quite a few countries there, and everywhere else you're allowed to visit. Okay, so I redistributed regionally those visitor numbers from those banned countries, and I had two scenarios. This is the extreme scenario, so you get some countries that would benefit hugely from such an amazing rule. Okay, Poland, Spain, you would benefit hugely. Indonesia would benefit hugely. Japan would benefit hugely from that regional respreading of the numbers of visitors, of tourism. Okay, silly idea. I love that paper. Strangely enough, it's one of my least cited papers. In fact, I think I only had 2 citations of that I checked the other day. And that's because I chose this outlet, which basically the journal has no internet presence whatsoever. And so for any young researchers, see, that's the wisdom of actually choosing your publication outlet very, very carefully. I'm sure it would be cited hundreds, if not thousands of times if it had gone in somewhere else. And this is where I come clean and say, well, actually, I have visited some of those countries and had a very good time there. Thank you very much. And these are some photographs. This one's on my office door, actually, so people will be familiar with that. That's visiting Myanmar back in 1996, I think that was. And this is Myanmar again, which I had a bit of a love affair with Myanmar again on a tourism field trip. That's me holding hands with a Myanmar general. So, yeah, I'm in with the Myanmar military. Okay, another bit of research, and again around the sort of ethical lines and how can tourism do good for certain communities or certain sort of segments of society, and this was looking at tourism and disability. And this bit of research was actually sparked by a newspaper article in the ODT where these developers wanted to put a monorail that would go from Queenstown through to Milford Sound. And at the time, a lot of people thought this was hugely destructive because it was going to mow through all this beautiful beech forest. And I agreed with that. But what really niggled me when I read that article was that they mentioned that this would provide access to those who are aged and infirm, access to nature for them. And I thought this was quite disingenuous and it wasn't really based on any data. And I thought it was actually really exploiting people with disabilities and the aged, people with mobility disabilities, and using them for their sort of nefarious means of getting their proposal approved. So I decided to undertake this research involving people with disabilities as participants in the project to see, well, what do you really want in terms of your contact with nature? And I found that they don't want these large-scale big developments through the middle of beech forest. They want improved contact, better contact with nature, but mainly through small-scale developments, through wheelchair tracks and through better paths and what have you, but not this type of stuff at all. So this was pretty much shot down these developers' arguments in flames. Now, another little bit of research continuing that sort of ethics theme is around medical tourism. And this is some research which I undertook with Dr. Brent Lovelock from the Department of Preventive and Social Medicine. And we engaged with a group of medical tourists, New Zealand medical tourists, who'd travelled overseas and come back after receiving treatment overseas. And so we were interested in their experiences, how they felt about the ethics of medical tourism and what their actual experiences, their medical experiences were while over there in the destination and then upon return to New Zealand. And of course, there were huge variations in what those people did experience, and some people had wonderful experiences, the life-saving experiences, and other people had a very, very, very terrible time. So the common sort of points that came through from this research are around the difficulties of finding good treatment options overseas, that the quality is quite varied. Another key theme from that research was the problems encountered when you try to condense treatment within a very short period of time to have your treatment within a holiday period. So you want to have 2 weeks and you want to have a heart transplant, or not quite a heart transplant, let's just say a new valve in your heart, and you want to get it done in 2 weeks and come back to New Zealand. Dangerous, don't do that, okay? So condensing that time is another huge challenge. So there are huge ethical and treatment-wise, some huge issues with medical tourism. Now we've continued that work, and especially with Professor Carl Lyons from the dental school, looking at dental tourism. Most of the research on medical tourism is focused on the destination region or focused on the actual patients, but it hasn't focused on what happens back home in the generating region. So we undertook a nationwide survey and follow-up interviews with dentists, dental professionals throughout New Zealand to look at their perceptions of dental tourism. So what it means for them when they have to potentially retreat patients when they come back from failed treatment overseas. It was actually quite hard for me to find a copyright-free image around dentists. So I found this picture which is of my teeth. So you can see that I lived quite close to a rural shop that had sold lots of lollies, and would bike past that on my way home every day from the school. But anyway, So we found, again, a number of common themes from this research, from the survey and from the interviews. That one, it's hard to find good dental treatment overseas. Two, that informed consent is very difficult to come by. Informed consent, the quality of that is very, very low. Three, they use a whole raft of different, equipment, machinery in your mouth, and so when you come back with this new stuff in your mouth, New Zealand dentists don't know what to do with it, basically. So there were some huge problems, and the quality of the treatment varied hugely amongst the patients that our New Zealand dentists did see. So that is some important stuff there, and I think there are some important messages for the dental sector about advising New Zealanders who potentially do want to travel overseas to choose your provider very, very carefully. So basically all that sort of ethical work culminated in this co-authored book with Brent Lovelock about the ethics of tourism. And we saw this as Robin's already spoken about this, as a resource mainly for students, but also for researchers as well. And just a way of opening people's eyes to the whole raft of different ethical issues that come about through tourism. So the stuff there on sex tourism and disability, how we address our relationship with nature and tourism. It's a great book. Okay, and an important part of the book actually was how we can do good for communities through tourism. And a lot of the research that I've done on that particular sub-theme has been with postgraduate students, with PhD students in particular. And this is an image from one of my current PhD students, Saiful Islam, of a lake called Boga Lake, which is in the hill tracts of Bangladesh. And he's working there with communities in trying to develop a sort of monitoring system for sustainable tourism. Because quite often these communities go into tourism, and they don't really think about the potential impacts on their communities and on the environments that those communities sort of live in of the growth of tourism. So he's doing some very, very cool stuff there around sustainable tourism indicators. So I'm very proud of that. But I've worked with some amazing PhD students, and it's hard to pick out, ones which are great, but just some examples of really good projects where these students are producing really great outcomes. Is Arif Hoke, again, who did research in Bangladesh on communities there, looking at the roles of NGOs in tourism development. So really challenging this concept of community-based tourism development. Some work with Lanara Tuipaloa in Samoa, working on Upper Lima Island, and looking at the importance of engaging communities at a very, very, very early stage to get these sort of seminal decisions around what tourism is going to look like in those communities. Sandeep Basniat in Nepal, looking at the value for underpaid, overworked hotel workers, the value for them in engaging in unions. So that's just a few from the many. But back to nature. This is the Kairinga Cub group, and I don't know why I've got a... Oh, yes, that's right. This is coming on to the nature-based tourism stream, so coming back from ethics back into nature-based tourism. And really, I remember the first time I went on a tramping trip, and it was a scout trip, actually, so that's cubs, so I've just blocked out those cubs there because I didn't like them very much. But this is the first trip I went on. It was up into the Ruhini Ranges, and it was to the Bedpahangana hut, which eventually became one of our favourite little huts to go into, and we'd go up there and we'd go shooting and what have you. But I just opened my eyes actually for what nature really was. Coming from the flatlands, the badlands of the Manawatu, where there were just macrocarpus and magpies and lots of ryegrass and clover, and you're just surrounded by this lushness and these little bugs that want to bite you the whole time. It just really opened my eyes about a different type of nature. And so I decided to expand upon this theme in my research, and working closely with Anna, who's sitting over there, who's our co-director of our Centre for Recreation Research. We engaged in a number of projects looking at how people engage with nature in national parks and conservation parks around the south of the South Island. This is one of our studies we've done on Ahariri and Ruataniwha conservation parks, visitor studies. We did a number of these for the Department of Conservation. So just looking at what visitors do, what they want, and how to improve their experiences in nature. And then we were lucky enough to receive funding from the Sport and Recreation Commission, which is now Sport New Zealand, who are interested in exploring how we can get people to commit to their nature-based recreation and stop them dropping out from their recreation. So again, it's back to this R3, recruitment, retention, and reactivation research. And so this, we undertook research with participants, did in-depth interviews from these people who had been key nature-based participants for all their lives. So what was the secret? What was the secret for them staying committed for their lives? And it came down to actually some of their very early childhood experiences, being inducted into that through their friends and through their whānau, but also being allowed to have this free play. And I see Claire in the audience there because you do a lot of research on this, Claire. And so this sort of aligns with the work that you're doing around free play and the importance of getting kids out into the outdoors. And nature, any nature, it could just be a scrappy little bit of a pine tree down the end of the road there. And so people used to tell us these horrendous stories about them sliding down these hills on rusty sheets of corrugated iron, which would just be their way of getting into nature, and giving them a little bit of resilience at the same time. So that early induction and that resilience that they got from their early play were critical to maintaining their careers in nature. And then another Spark-funded research was looking at immigrants' experiences of nature-based recreation in New Zealand. At the time, we used to do these nationwide, when I say we, Spark used to do these nationwide surveys of recreation, looking at the percentages of Pākehā, Māori, Pacifica who would engage in tramping, hunting, fishing, blah, blah, blah. And they would find that the minority ethnicities would actually have lower levels of engagement relative to sort of mainstream Pākehā New Zealand. And so we wanted to engage with these recent immigrants, these new New Zealanders, to see what they actually wanted from their experiences in nature. And we found that, people wanted different things from nature, but there were some commonalities. Pacifica, for example, wanted to engage with their families and with food, and not in any, in-depth, way out in the middle of the wilderness nature, but something on the periphery of nature. Chinese New Zealanders wanted to engage in nature, again, not in a wilderness sense, but nature where they could see the presence of humans in nature. So nature framed by humanity, I guess. And we'd talked to some people who had refugee experiences, and the very thought of them going and sleeping in tents or in hut would remind them of their experience in refugee camps, and so that was completely out of the picture for them. So I guess the key message from this type of research was a sort of prescriptive approach where you would have the sort of mainstream Pākehā saying, thou shalt go out into the wilderness and do your tramping trip for 7 days, then come back, doesn't work for everyone. It's just like saying that every kid wants to and should play rugby or something like that. And so this brings me to the subject. Okay, I need to explain a couple of things in this picture. And, okay, yep, no, we're good. Someone come just grab me if I do bang on too long, please. Okay, so the picture, this little beast here, I've got Anna to thank for that. So Anna bought this at a Otago Polytechnic School of Art, didn't you? Was it no, it wasn't, well, no. She bought it for me anyway. A little to know that it would appear a few years later in my professorial lecture. Okay, this was a little artwork produced by an artist called Jared Howlett, and he has done a series of these strange little animals, and they're supposed to represent like a dystopian nature. Let me explain something else. Exocene. What is Exocene? Okay, you guys have heard of the Anthropocene, right? The Anthropocene is an era which is dominated by humanity. Okay? Exocene takes that one little step further. Well, actually, that's quite different, really. It's describing an era where nature is dominated by invasive species, basically, by not native nature, if you know what I mean, okay? So we live in a world where, a hybrid world, where almost no nature is pure. So that's the exocene. And so this little beastie here is a sort of beast that you might envisage in this hybrid world, hybrid between nature and technology, native species, introduced species, invasive, non-invasive. Anyway, it was fun taking the picture. So what are alien invasive species? Not that, I don't know. It's invasive alien species is a term used in invasion ecology, and so we try to use it in the Marsden Project as much as we can. So invasive alien species are those species who come to a place that's outside of their natural range. They might breed and spread very, very rapidly, and they might cause problems which are ecological problems, economic problems, or social problems. So they cause harm. Okay, and there's this great book by Jeff McNeely, who's a pretty well-known biologist, called The Great Reshuffling, and it's about how the world is changing. We're shuffling these species around. Right as we speak, there are species sort of spreading here and there. These are invasive species. And of course, in New Zealand, we have quite a whole raft of these invasive species, and these were introduced mainly towards the end of the 19th century by our acclimatisation societies. Every province had their acclimatisation society, and they'd make a list and they'd go forth into the world and they would get these species and bring them into New Zealand. At one stage, they wanted to bring lions into New Zealand and buffalo for hunting purposes. So these species were brought here to make the place more like home, like old Blighty. So, you know, you'd have stuff which would remind you of home, but also to feed and clothe settlers, so furry animals and edible animals, and also species to hunt, so deer species, and trout and salmon, for example. The problem being with invasive species, we're looking at the social dimensions of invasive species, so what people think about invasive species. I'm not a biologist, okay? Even though I've got a forestry science degree, I don't pretend to be a biologist. The big issue with invasive species and their control from this point on is around the social contract for managing invasive species, because they're hugely expensive to maintain. I think around about $1.7 trillion over the last 40 years have been spent on actually managing, controlling invasive species. In New Zealand, we spend about $1.4 billion a year managing invasive species. It's a lot of money that could spend on hospitals, education, okay? So to keep on doing this, we need a social contract to carry on spending this amount of money and engaging in programs like Predator Free 2050, like Save the Kiwi, like Project Crimson. It all costs money. And of course, we are all paying for this as well. And I didn't even notice this until I was looking at my rates, which arrived just the other day, and found that, God, the rates are horrendous, aren't they? Anyway, it's another topic. That we're all paying for wilding trees control in Otago, which is great. I don't mind paying $2.02. I'd pay more. I'd pay $20. I'd probably pay $200. No, I wouldn't pay $200. But we're all paying, and so we need this ongoing commitment, so the social contract for these programs to continue, and that's what we're researching through this Marsden project, what people think about invasive species and what values they assign to those invasive species. One of the sparks for this research was something a project I undertook 15 years ago with a researcher called David Palmer, who some of you might know, who passed away in a tramping accident a few years ago. And we went down to Rakiura, Stewart Island, and did some research there with domestic and international visitors and asked them what they thought about a whole raft of different species, including some native and some introduced species. And we came up with some quite key themes that there was an awareness amongst visitors that there were these problem species, but there was quite a difference between domestics and internationals about the types of control that we should do. Don't mention poison, don't mention 1080, don't mention shooting for international visitors. There was virtually no support for those types of control mechanisms, even though they recognise that these species, these possums and deer and other nasties, were hugely problematic. And then we asked them about this vehicular control method for possums, which you might be aware of. And this is a silly little question we threw in just for fun, basically. Can you still do that? I'm not sure if we get away with it these days. If driving a car and you saw a possum sitting in the middle of the road, would you swerve to hit the possum or miss it? Okay, so hands up those who would swerve to miss it. Hands up those who would swerve to hit it. Sometimes you just can't help, can you, Anna? Okay, well, we found quite a difference there between our New Zealand visitors, domestic visitors, and international visitors. Okay, so there's our Kiwis. There we go. 55% would say they'd swerve to hit it. Internationals, oh no, we can't do that. They're so cute. Okay. So the thing is that for these invasive species, communities actually get value from these invasive species. They might get value in terms of like utilitarian value, but often it's sort of symbolic value as well. And often communities actually will adopt these species in their regional tourism branding. For example, you've got welcome to Gore. It's the world capital of brown trout fishing, okay, with the big fish. There's another big fish at Rakaia. There's probably other big fish that I don't know about. You've got hop into Waimati. You used to be able to get a wallaby pie there. Not sure if you still can. Welcome to Mossburn, the deer capital. You've got a red deer statue, possibly I think that might be Mossburn again, I'm not really sure. And then you've got the Himalayan Tar statue at Lake Pukaki. Okay, so you've got communities that engage with this, and you've got visitors traveling around the country, and they see these signs and they see these statues and they think, oh, are we supposed to be celebrating the presence of deer here in Aotearoa, New Zealand? Or, you know, or trout or what have you. And if anyone read this morning's ODT and you read the article by Joe Bennett, did you see that? And he raised the question about trout, actually, about predator-free, and he said, well, trout are a predator, and shouldn't we be controlling trout? Oh, no, because we like to catch trout and to eat trout, and so that's why we don't count them as a predator, and we're not going to control them. So it's quite arbitrary, really, as to what becomes invasive and what gets controlled and what not. But coming back to tar, here's this wonderful person, the 11th Duke of Bedford, who was lucky enough to gift us some tar back in 1903. There's him as a young man, and then as an older gentleman there. He was also president of the UK British Cremation Society for 20 years, so he was dead keen on cremation. But anyway, so there we've got Himalayan tar, and this is one of our species that we're looking at in the Marsden project, so we're one of our 4 case study species. Himalayan tar are a wonderful creature, beautiful, beautiful creature, and of course they're very popular for hunting, both for domestic hunters and for introduced hunters, and for international hunters who pay a lot of money. In fact, some work that Dr. Victoria Kahui and I did, she's from the economics department, a few years ago, we estimated about $12 million worth of value from the aerial hunting of helicopter-assisted hunting of Himalayan tar. But they do cause damage. They impact upon the subalpine and alpine flora and fauna. They eat the Mount Cook lily, which is actually a buttercup. So there's conflicting values going on there, what we have to take into consideration and moving forward. And of course, when DOC were trying to undertake control of Himalayan tar in 2020, and they had quite a big program of helicopter hunting planned, this was legally challenged by the Tar Foundation. They were opposed to the so-called Tarmageddon. Okay, so there are a number of challenges to invasive species, and one of the big challenges is this thing we call denialism. The Marsden team will hear me banging on about denialism the whole time. So denialism is about the idea that a species can be invasive because we accept everything in this hybrid world. We accept these translocations that happen purposefully and by accident. Okay, so Stephen Jay Gould is one of the proponents of this denialism, that there's no such thing as a native species, and that nativism is evil because it can be extended towards society as well, and a rejection of people who are not native to our society, to our communities. And this is work by Fred Pearce, who writes about the value of invasive species in saving the world when we've got these big challenges of climate change. So we get some invasive species will be able to cope with climate change and It'll be able to sequester carbon, for example, so we get very quick growing wilding pines that can sequester carbon, or we get warmer waters, and so we get some introduced coarse fish can survive in those polluted warm waters. So that might be our saviour. These are all contested ideas, of course. So this whole idea of a species, can it be native, is it native or is it introduced? A challenge by species such as this. You recognise this? Of course, this is the silvereye, or my dad used to call them the waxeye, one of our favourite little birds that they come around in little flocks and do their stuff. And of course, there was no record in New Zealand of silvereye here until 1832. And so they're considered to be self-introduced and therefore to be native because they've established breeding colonies. Obviously, they've been breeding here for years and years and years. But there were records from the trans-Tasman sailing ships of these exhausted little silvereyes landing on the riggings halfway across the Tasman and then staying on the boat for the rest of the voyage naturally until they come to Aotearoa. And so were they helped? Were they assisted? You know, did they get a little bit of a free ride there? So can we still consider them to be native? I'm not sure. And I really love the te reo Māori term for silvereye, which is tauhu, which means stranger. So it's a stranger which has arrived, or a new arrival into New Zealand. But there are a number of stranger birds which have come about too. Oh, sorry, this whole idea of it's introduced, therefore it's bad, or it's native, therefore it's good, is challenged by this. This is a photograph of a pile of kea beaks. And of course, kea had bounties on them until the 1970s and didn't actually get absolute protection in New Zealand until 1986. And so people would actually go out and hunt these things down because they would pick and get the fat off the back of the sheep. Naughty kea. It's not such a problem now because the kea range has been hugely reduced due to that hunting and those bounties. But of course, other species that have come here, we love, and this is a picture of Dennis Glover, who wrote the famous poem The Magpies, the Kortuloo Ladle Wardle Doodle poem that some of you would have learned at school. Okay, and as I said, I was raised with hearing this Kortuloo Ladle Wardle Doodle of the magpies on the farm back in the Manawatu. So some of these introduced species have inveigled their way into our arts and into our hearts, and it would be hard to imagine life without them. Right, okay, whizzing through. So it's not just those experts, the Stephen Jay Goulds and what have you, that have these opinions about invasive species. Everyone has an opinion about invasive species. This is just a collection of letters to the editor from the ODT over the last few weeks about some pine trees that have been removed in Alexandra, okay, because they are potentially spreading and creating problems spreading through the beautiful tussock land. Okay, so for every letter that was saying, save the trees, we want to keep our trees, there's another letter saying, no, get rid of the trees. So hugely important. And this is another one of our case studies in Te Manahuna Mackenzie Basin, where we're going to look at how people attribute values to some of these invasive conifer species. Another reason why we need to be looking at this and why this Marsden research is really, really important is because New Zealand society is changing so dramatically over the last few years. Or when I say few years, the last few decades, and the projections that it would change even more dramatically moving forward. So we've got the whole conservation conversation in New Zealand has been dominated by mainstream white middle-class Pākehās since the 1970s, right and through until the current time. And so all of our policy around invasive species management has also been shaped by that group within society. But with the demographic change that we're seeing, we can't guarantee that will still be the same conversation moving forward, that there might be different levels of commitment to different species, to different programs, and there might be actually a fall off, or it might be an increase in commitment, I'm not sure. And that's what we're exploring in the Marsden by actually engaging with these different communities, with new New Zealanders, with Pacifica, with Chinese New Zealanders, with South Asian New Zealanders, with young New Zealanders. What messages are they getting moving forward? And did you know that actually New Zealand punches above its weight in terms of our invasive species overseas? This is the Arthrodendius triangulatus, which is probably takes the prize for the ugliest invasive species. This is found in the UK, where it eats their earthworms. Yes, and is a big, big agricultural problem. I had another photograph of one actually engulfing an earthworm, but it was just too disturbing to show you. And this is cabbage tree, a humble cabbage tree, Te Kuka, and it's a problem in California where it's spreading through in some national parks and region and state parks. Who would have thought it? Are you proud of our cabbage tree for doing that? Are you proud of our Arthrodendius triangulatus, leading our reverse colonization? And here's a little epilobium. That's not an epilobium. Oh, perhaps it is an epilobium actually. Brunescens, which is one of the main agricultural pest crops in the UK, rated in the top 20 of the agricultural weeds in the UK, because it gets into all sorts of crops there. Again, reverse colonization. So we're coming to a very, very sticky point in this conversation around invasives. You know, we want to get rid of the pine trees and other conifers from the hills around Queenstown, but there's been a pushback from some aspects in the community there about that. We wanted to change the vegetation around Arrowtown and to remove some of those beautiful, colourful species, and there's been pushback against that as well, because of course these are sort of iconic views of these tourist destinations. I mean, the irony is that we rely upon 100% pure New Zealand, but so much of our promotional material is not really, and so much of our landscapes is not really pure. Perhaps we're only 32% pure. In fact, if this was a photograph taken of the little screensaver when you hop into Air New Zealand flight, showing the beautiful Russell Lupines, and Russell Lupines are, of course, a nasty bit of works. They're from Europe originally, and are hugely invasive. In fact, there was a lady, I can't remember her name, but she was known as the super spreader of conifers through the Te Manahuna Mackenzie Basin. This is another super spreader. This is a perch. This is another one of our Marsden projects, one of our case studies. This is what we call a coarse fish. Okay, coarse fish are everything that except trout and salmon. So they include things like tench and rudd and perch and what have you. And some of those species, and koi carp, and some of those species create huge damage to the waterways in terms of disturbing the silt and lowering the quality of the water. And this is another super spreader here, a guy who was a British migrant, and he spread a lot of these fish illegally throughout the waterways, especially around the Waikato, which is the sort of epicenter of our coarse fish industry, I guess, and another site of one of our Marsden bits of field work. The problem, of course, when you've got these invasive species, some of them look quite nice. You know, this is the road going up to Aoraki Mount Cook, alongside Lake Pukaki, and you've got a mixture of different conifers there, and that looks like, oh, could be somewhere nice in North America, could be Europe, couldn't it? Oh, let's just leave those trees there, shall we? Because if you go to control them, it doesn't look quite so nice, does it? And so we're involving in this conversation the tourism sector, tourists, to try to get their perspective on how they see these species and the options for management or control of these species. And just in a little pre-study we did just before the Marsden begun, we did a survey. This was with Yun, who's sitting here somewhere. Yun, hello Yun, who was a master's student at the time, now a PhD student in the department. And we did a survey of 238, I think, visitors in the Te Manahuna and around Queenstown, looking at their attitudes and knowledge towards wild conifers. And I don't expect you to look at all that, but basically those are showing you that there's a low level of awareness of the problems of some of these species, but importantly also differences between those different visitor source markets as to how they understand and react to those species. And so we could see, for example, if you look at the yellow and the black, that's bad, okay? So those, we would show these participants pictures of the species and talk about them, then we would educate them and say, okay, did you know that wild conifers cause a huge problem in terms of invading natural tussock lands and doing this and that and the other? Would you still like to see them? And so This is the percentage of people in these different visitor markets who will still want to see these species in their tourist itineraries. There's Russell Lupines. We did the same thing again. Russell lupin is a nasty because it invades the braided riverbeds, which are really the nesting sites for ryebull and banded dotterel and other species there, and they also provide cover for the predators. So it's a huge problem. And again, very low level of awareness amongst visitors that Russell lupin actually are an ecological problem, even amongst New Zealand visitors. And you expect New Zealanders to know a little bit about this. And again, these differences between these different visitor markets in terms of what they want to see done with these species. Yes, I want to see them in the future, or no, I'd like them to be controlled. So this is important research in terms of developing messaging for those different visitor markets around how we move forward. I'll skip through that. There's the Marsden team, wonderful team. Hopefully some of them are online now because they can't be with us. There's Eru Metcalf, who's our master's researcher based in Otautahi Christchurch, who's doing research on coarse fish and coming up with some really interesting stuff. There, Matthias, who's up there, Matthias Spall, a PhD researcher doing work on conifers. Anna, who's our co-leader in the project. There's me, and there's Claire Dowsett, who's doing research on poaka, or wild pigs, in the Whanganui, and finding some really important stuff up there. Of course, pigs are a huge economic pest. They spread TB, but also they cause damage in forest. But they're a hugely valued species in terms of wild pork and this food security aspect, but also recreational aspect for communities in the Whanganui. So hugely challenging in terms of coming up with a control strategy for that. And what is hugely valuable about the Marsden project is it has these sort of spring-offs as well. And one of the spring-off little projects is some work I'm doing with Dr. Karu Narawat, who's a graduate from our department, looking at Himalayan tar. So what we're doing is we're engaging with Nepalese New Zealanders to see what they think about the control of Himalayan tar in New Zealand, because of course, as the name suggests, Himalayan tar come from the Himalaya and are native to Nepal, but over there they're actually classified as a near-threatened species, and so they're considered to be quite special and quite important by Nepalese. Meanwhile, in New Zealand, we actually go through shooting these things by the thousand and leaving them rotting on the hillside, which is sort of a lot of our participants we've spoken to so far don't feel that's such a good approach. Another offspring is with Dr. Stephen Parker, who's sitting up there, who was another graduate from our department, and we're looking with invasive plants as being potential, well, they're not potential, they already are, resources for herbal medicine. And so we're engaging with herbalists to see what they think about some of these species and whether they should be controlled or not, and how we can work together with agencies who do want to control these species. Okay, so it's time to say thank you. I think my time has come to an end. And so I guess the big thank you is for a start, to my colleagues and students from the Department of Tourism, and as a former colleagues and students as well. Happy bunch of people, as you can see. It's quite bizarre to think that I've been there for, gosh, is it 22 years, 23 years? Which is actually longer. You have longer contact with some of your colleagues than you do with members of your own family. My God, I mean, I got rid of my kids, they buggered off when they were 18 years old. So yeah, of course, you know, with that length of time, they are family, and that with all the trials and tribulations that family does bring, but a wonderful bunch of people and students and my academic colleagues. So a big ngā mihi nui for you. That's my mum and dad, very, very fashionable people back in the 1950s. I think that photograph was taken before I was even conceptualised. But very dashing. I'm not sure, that's probably an invasive species my mum is wearing there. Hopefully it's an invasive species. But without them, this wouldn't be possible. And to my family, strange looking bunch of people. But those are my two brothers there. My older brother, who's an ex-dairy farmer from the Manawatu, and my middle brother there, who lives in Scotland. So big hello to you guys and to my kids, who I do miss. That's Millie, and Millie's doing her PhD at Manchester University. And that's Levi and his family, so Jamie and Julian, and his wife Jenny, and they're based in Seattle. And that's Oscar, he's over in the UK. My kids, all wonderful, I guess highly talented. They've all got master's degrees. They worked far harder at university than I ever did. And of course Millie's doing her PhD, and so miss you heaps and can't wait to catch up, and hopefully we'll be seeing Millie at Christmas time, all going well. And to Anna, sorry, words do fail me. But Anna's not only my partner in life, but also co-director of the Centre for Recreation Research, a wonderful lateral thinker, and big hug. So that's it from me. Thank you very much for your time. Can I sit down now? No, I don't sit down.
Yeah, you do sit down.
I do sit down.
Yeah.
I do sit down. Okay.
Is it on? Yes, 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 yes. Well done, Brent. Good evening, everyone. I'm Hazel Tucker, and as a long-time colleague of Brent's in the tourism department, it's my absolute pleasure to say a few words of thanks to wrap up Brent's IPL. I'd like to start by thanking everyone for coming tonight, and particularly acknowledge Brent's whānau, and a big hi to Millie, Oscar and Levi, if you managed to get up in time. I hope you did. Yeah, I think Brent and I we're really relieved, shall I say, delighted, relieved that his IPL has finally managed to happen, because as was said earlier, there have been many delays, and it's actually been so long since his promotion that the university's on its third vice-chancellor since that time. As we've heard tonight from Brent, that his work in the area of ethics and the practice of our relationships with nature is particularly significant. We could all see that. And I'd like to make another big shout out for his book, very important book, The Ethics of Tourism, which has been a really important resource for students particularly, but for teachers, for researchers, practitioners, and so on. And I was delighted to hear from Brent recently that the publishers have begged him, I think, to do a second edition, an updated version of the book. So I think we can all look forward to that. Beyond ethics and nature, Brent's research, as we heard tonight, has covered a broad spectrum of tourism-related themes over the years, some of which he's had a chance to tell us about tonight, some he hasn't. These have included medical tourism, which he did mention briefly, but also important topics such as tourism and food security, poverty alleviation, and then subjects such as coffee tourism and even toilets and tourism. And I think when you come to think about it, toilets are quite important in the tourist experience, particularly public toilets. So So yeah, tonight we've mostly learned about the kind of core area of Brent's work, which is exploration of human nature relationships, and how these relationships, or how these relationships can should best be managed, and that's been the kind of core theme of his research. And he really throws into question many received wisdoms and assumptions about human nature relationships. For example, he questions how we perceive good and bad in nature, and he's considered the significance of broader benefits gained from certain activities such as hunting, which are otherwise often contested on ethical grounds. So just to kind of sum up, really, as I said, Brent and I go back a long way. We both started in the tourism department at roughly the same time, around kind of the year 2000. And I can therefore personally vouch for the fact that Brent is not only a great scholar, we've seen that tonight, he's also a fantastic teacher, but kind of most of all, and I think all of the people in the tourism department and across the School of Business and the university would agree with me that he's an absolutely awesome colleague, really, really awesome colleague, much respected and much loved. So Brent, I have, if I can find it, oh yes, there it is. I would like you to come up so that I can present to you a small token of appreciation from the university. Thank you very much for your hard work.